Rome's power didn't come from its army alone, it came from money. We all like to imagine the Roman legions as unstoppable warriors driven by honor and discipline, but behind every polished helmet and sharp gladius was an enormous supply chain and cost. Thousands of soldiers needed food, weapons, and pay. Horses needed to be fed. Timber and labor were required for sieges, and all of it required money, lots of it. So how did Rome manage centuries of conquest, and why does it still matter today? Because the closer you look at Rome, the clearer the truth becomes. Wars weren't just fought on the battlefield. They were fought within the financial system as well. And once that system started moving, it couldn't stop. Expansion wasn't a choice, it was an economic necessity. Sound familiar? Let's start. In the early Republic, Rome's army was a citizen army. If you owned land, you could be drafted. Soldiers brought their own weapons and expected to return home when the campaign ended. But as the Republic expanded, wars became longer and farther away. The old system no longer worked. You couldn't just grab a spear and go fight for a year anymore. You needed professional soldiers. That's when Rome began centralizing military financing. The state started paying soldiers, not much, but enough to keep them loyal. Then came the real turning point. Conquests became a revenue model. Every new province brought new taxes, new slaves, new mines, and tribute. It was a self-reinforcing cycle. War funded more war. But here's where it gets strange and dangerous. Rome didn't just rely on taxes, it borrowed heavily. During long and expensive wars like the Punic Wars, the Republic took massive loans from wealthy elites, especially the rising financial class, the equities. This wasn't charity, it was an investment, and investors expected returns, interest, tax collection rights, commercial privileges in conquered lands. In short, war had become a business. Sound familiar, right? Over time, this militarized economy changed everything. Political power shifted to generals, who gathered support with promises of loot. Senators became shareholders in violence. Private contractors, the publicani, managed everything from logistics to tax collection, pocketing profits. It was military-industrial capitalism, in a toga. And the costs? They piled up. To pay soldiers and creditors, the state constantly had to find new sources of revenue. When conquests slowed or uprisings drained the treasury, Rome did the oldest trick in the book. It devalued money. Under Nero, the silver content of the denarius was quietly reduced. For the next 2 centuries, emperors continued the practice. Trust eroded, inflation rose, and by the 3rd century, Rome's monetary system was on the verge of collapse. Meanwhile, the rich got even richer. Senators and equities secured their wealth in land, slaves, and overseas accounts. The poor paid taxes in devalued currency while the elite enjoyed exemptions and exclusive deals. Public services broke down, corruption soared. The financial burden of endless wars fell squarely on the lower classes through inflation, forced labor, and conscription. This wasn't just a military collapse, it was a financial collapse. Now look around. Governments are running massive deficits. Wars are funded by debt. Central banks quietly print money to cover shortfalls. The financial class profits from defense contracts and crises. The economy depends on constant expansion, military, monetary, or market-based, to keep running. Not exactly the same maybe, but the DNA is eerily similar. Rome teaches us this. An economy built on constant growth, especially violent growth, will eventually collapse. When there's no land left to conquer, no resources to extract, no enemies to fight, the system turns inward. Debt and expectations remain, but revenue dries up. That's when the state squeezes its own people. More taxes, more currency devaluation, more control. Bread and circuses keep the public quiet while the elites live comfortably. Today we don't call it tribute. We call it taxes, monetary expansion, or policy. But the mechanics are shockingly similar. Central banks print money. Governments spend without thinking about income. The rich get richer. The poor struggle to make ends meet on shrinking salaries. Wars are still financed by debt. The U.S. spent over $2 trillion on the war in Afghanistan, mostly borrowed. Who gets the contracts? Who earns the interest? Who pays the bill? You know the answer. And like in Rome, the cycle feeds itself. Once debt becomes the default, you don't need an emergency to print money, just enough to avoid collapse. The extraordinary becomes normalized, and the longer it goes on, the harder it is to act as if everything is fine until it's not. That's why economic history matters. These aren't just old stories, they're warning signs. Look at Rome. The state handed over financial power to private hands, became addicted to growth, emptied its currency, and burdened its citizens with unsustainable obligations. Not because it was evil, but because the system had no off switch. Today we live in a different world, digital, global, and driven by capital flows. But the system is still the same. Money and power move together. War is still profitable. Inflation still punishes the people. Financial illusions still work, until they don't. So what should you do? First, see the pattern. Most people don't. Most people think inflation is random, taxes are unavoidable, debt is freedom, and growth can go on forever, until reality proves otherwise. You can't fully step outside the system, but you can understand it. Stop playing blindly. Build resilience, not just with money, but with mindset. That means studying financial history, not just personal finance. Watching for signs of stress in the system, not just market hype. And asking, who benefits when I stay confused? Because you were supposed to be unaware of this. You weren't supposed to ask how Rome funded its wars, or how modern states do it. You were meant to focus on the theater, the headlines, GDP numbers, distractions, not the mechanics, not the incentives. But now you know, and once you see it, there's no going back. Financial education isn't just about budgets and investing. It's about understanding power and systems. It's about seeing through illusions. Next time you hear about a new conflict, stimulus, or crisis, don't just watch. Follow the money. Ask, who lends, who profits, who pays? Because if history teaches us anything, empires don't fall when enemies cross their borders. They fall when the math doesn't add up, and no one dares to fix it. Please subscribe and support me to keep this kind of content coming. Goodbye.